Pollute. That's the word that the chief technology officer at the Pentagon used yesterday to describe what would happen if Anthropic's Claude entered the military supply chain. Not compromise, not limit, pollute, as in contaminate, as in safety commitments baked into this model's architecture are a toxin that would degrade weapon systems, body armor, and warfighter protection. Now, the same day, a separate Defense Department official confirmed that generative AI chatbots are already being used to rank military strike targets and recommend which ones to hit first. So, an AI system designed with safety principles is pollution, and an AI system racing to kill is just infrastructure. All right, let's talk about what that means when these two statements exist somehow in the same theoretical sentence. So here's the landscape for today. There's a word for what happens when the categories a system uses to organize itself stop matching the reality they're supposed to describe. In engineering, it's called a mismatch. In governance, it's called a crisis. And in biology, it's called a constraint being revealed. Now, the Pentagon's pollute framing is not an insult, it's an architectural claim. So Emil Michael is saying that Claude's safety commitments aren't a setting that you can toggle. They're woven into the weights, the training, the model's constitutional structure. And because they can't be cleanly separated from the capability, the whole system becomes incompatible with an unrestricted military deployment. So he's actually right about the technical point. The values and the capability are indeed entangled, but where he's wrong is in calling that a defect. Anthropic calls it design philosophy, and the collision between these two framings is producing something that neither side really planned. The first real-world confrontation over whether AI systems carry their creators' values in ways that surpass geopolitical interests and consequences. So meanwhile, nearly 1,000 researchers handed AI the hardest exam ever built. You heard about humanity's last exam quite a while ago, and now it's out. Okay, and it stripped out every question that any current system could answer. So what remains is a ceiling map, a topography of what intelligence cannot yet do, drawn by humans who still can. All right, over in energy, two things happened that share a logic so clean it's almost musical. Virginia's legislature voted 96-0, that's unanimous, to let any household plug in 1,200 watts of solar energy without asking permission. And PJM, the largest grid operator in the country, started adjusting its transmission ratings every hour based on actual weather, unlocking 15 to 40% more capacity from wires that have been in the ground for decades. And over at the University of Geneva, a mirror image amino acid slipped through a door that only cancer cells really leave open, and they starved the tumor from the inside. All right, so what I see across all of this is constraint becoming visible. The Pentagon discovering that values are load-bearing structures inside the AI architecture, not decorative features that you can just remove. A benchmark revealing where artificial intelligence actually ends and human expertise still begins, at least for now. A grid learning that its own conservative assumptions were always the bottleneck and not the physical copper. A legislature recognizing that the utility approval process was a gate with no gatekeeper function left, and a molecule exploiting a structural asymmetry between healthy and cancerous cells that has been there since the cancer began, just waiting for somebody to notice it. So the day that constraints become visible is the day they start dissolving. Not painlessly and not automatically, but definitely irreversibly. All right, so let's dive deep into a few of the stories for today. I want to go inside the pollute statement because it's doing a lot more work than it initially appears. Emil Michael didn't say Claude is too weak for military use. He didn't say it lacks capability. He said it has a different policy preference. Those are his words, embedded in the architecture. And that preference would produce, also in his words, ineffective weapons, ineffective body armor, ineffective protection. So his implication is really specific. A model trained to weigh human safety, to resist generating instructions for mass harm, to consider ethical constraints as part of its reasoning. That model, when applied to military systems, would simply make those systems less lethal. That's what he's trying to say in not so many words. And for a defense infrastructure built around lethality as a core performance metric, obviously, then less lethal equals less functional. And that's apparently not acceptable. So now pair that with the MIT Technology Review disclosure from today as well. A Defense Department official described how generative AI is being layered on top of Project Maven's existing intelligence platforms, not as decision maker, but as conversational interface. So military personnel can query the system in natural language, and that system analyzes intelligence data, and it ranks potential targets, and it recommends strike priorities. So a human does review the output. But here's what I want you to notice about that architecture. Maven's older computer vision systems force users to look at maps, inspect satellite imagery, examine the actual data. What a chatbot does is it summarizes and abstracts. The human reviewing a chatbot's recommendation, therefore, is one step removed from the underlying intelligence. So while the official acknowledged that generative AI does reduce time in the targeting process, nobody specified how much time human verification then adds back afterwards. Do they have to go in and verify the summary that was provided to them? So this matters in the shadow of the Shajira Tayyip school strike in Iran, which killed more than 100 children. And the preliminary investigation found that outdated targeting data was partly responsible. So whether AI played any role is unknown. But the convergence of faster targeting with documented targeting failures creates a specific pressure. So speed in a system where the human review step is structurally thinned is not the same as speed in a system where human verification is robust. So the question isn't whether AI should be in the targeting chain. It's already there. But the question is what happens to the human role when the interface is designed for acceleration. So here's where the pollute framing connects back. If a model with embedded safety commitments would produce ineffective military outputs, meaning outputs that resist maximizing lethality, then the models being selected for targeting are the ones without those commitments. That's what's implied here. So the Pentagon is not just rejecting Anthropic, it's articulating a selection criterion. And that criterion filters for the models that will raise the fewest objections to the most consequential decisions a government can make. So what governance becomes in that environment, when a state actively seeks for AI systems that do not push back, that's the structural question forming underneath this whole confrontation. And it extends far past Anthropic, far past this administration even, into the permanent relationship between artificial intelligence and state power. So that's the question that we're really looking at here. All right, let's move on to humanity's last exam. I find this somewhat unsettling, but also kind of beautiful in equal measure as they're trying to work this out. 1,000 researchers across a dozen fields, actually dozens of fields, mathematics, ancient languages, natural sciences, and humanities, just to name a few, collaborated to build a 2,500 question test where every criterion for inclusion was no current AI can answer this question. So every candidate question was run against a frontier model. And if any of the models that it was run against got it right, then the question was thrown out. So what remains is a map of human knowledge that artificial intelligence cannot yet reach. So GPT-4o at the time scored 2.7%. Claude 3.5 Sonnet hit 4.1. And the most capable current systems, so you're looking at Gemini 3.1 Pro, Claude Opus 4.6, and the newly released GPT 4.5, they're in the range of 40 to 50%. So Dr. Tung Nguyen over at Texas A&M, who contributed 73 of those questions, he framed the point directly. He said, without accurate assessment tools, everyone, policymakers, developers, and the public risk misinterpreting what AI can actually do. So that's the point of humanity's last exam, despite the sensationalist title. It's not what he's trying to do. They're trying to give us a benchmark. And here's what makes this more than just a clever test. It's a snapshot of a moving boundary. So 3 years ago, existing benchmarks were adequate. 2 years ago, AI began saturating them. And today, the research community has to engineer evaluations specifically designed to resist current capability. And those evaluations, the ones that are built to be unsolvable, are already being half solved by the latest systems. Now, back in February, we tracked Gemini 3.1 Pro moving from 31% to 77% on the ARC AGI-2 in just 7 weeks. 7 weeks. So the distance between impossible for AI and routine to AI is compressing so fast. It's a rate that makes any static benchmark just a melting clock, essentially. So humanity's last exam is the first real benchmark that's designed with that compression in mind, moving toward the future. It's built to be perpetually ahead of capability. So the question now is how long perpetually lasts. And of course, the challenge of, is this simply moving the goalposts versus designed for that perpetuality inside the test itself? They claim that it is, so we'll see what happens here in the future. Now, what the exam really measures isn't AI's failure. It's the shrinking territory of exclusively human knowledge. So every domain where AI scores 0 today is a domain where researchers can still point and they can say, hey, this is ours. And this requires something that machines don't have yet. This is still ours. The pace at which those domains contract will be one of the clearest signals of the next 2 years. It's going to be exciting to watch. All right, let's look at the energy stories. I want to hold these together because they share a principle that I think is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in the entire infrastructure transition. So let's look at it. PJM interconnection serves 65 million people across 13 states. And until this week, it rated its transmission lines based on worst case temperature assumptions, so the hottest day of the year, even in the most conservative scenarios. Every other hour of every other day, those lines could always carry more electricity than the rating allowed. It had that buffer. So the capacity was always physically there to do more. The electrons could flow and the wires were capable, but the measurement framework said no, intentionally. They gave themselves that buffer. But now, PJM has them updating every hour. So this is actual temperature, actual atmospheric conditions, forecast extending to 10 days. And capacity on the existing lines now is increasing 40%. They're not adding new towers or new wires. There's no new right-of-way fights or anything like that. They're simply adjusting their measurement to catch up to physical reality. In other words, they're removing the buffer that they used to have in order to match the demands of power that America now has. And in Virginia, 96-0 in a vote. In a state where Dominion Energy has historically shaped energy legislation to an extraordinary degree, not a single legislator voted against allowing households to plug 1,200 watts of solar into a standard outlet. No utility approval, no interconnection study, no permitting. The panels became appliances, like a refrigerator and a television. You buy it, you plug it in, and you generate electricity. So despite the effort of a lot of power companies out there, this is moving forward. Now, Germany already has more than 1 million of these in use. The economics are modest on a per unit basis, 5 to 15% of a household's electricity, payback in maybe 2 to 5 years, the cost of the actual panel. So no single balcony panel changes the whole grid. But 1 million of them, 10 million of them, coordinated by nothing except sunlight and a price signal, that is a distributed generation layer that no central authority has really planned for. No utility approved it, and no grid operator controls it. It just emerges based on demand, one plug at a time. Now, both of these stories about power share the same deep structure. The constraint has never been physical. It was institutional. PJM's wires could always carry more. Virginia's household could always generate power. So what stood between capability and its use was a measurement regime in one case and a permission regime in another. And both regimes fell, not because the physics changed, but because the institutional assumption that justified them stopped being tenable as America's power crisis continues to grow. Now, that principle, discovering that the binding constraint was always the framework, not the infrastructure, that is going to be repeating across dozens of domains in the next few years. So wherever a conservative assumption from a slower era is still governing a system that has already outgrown it, watch for a change. All right, 3 arcs converging today. We've got the Anthropic Pentagon confrontation, which is now generating more institutional surface area than any AI governance question in history. And on our timeline, the supply chain risk designation was in early March. Got the lawsuits, the Amicus Coalition, which is Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Apple, 24 former military officials, 30 plus cross-competitor employees, including Google's chief scientist. And now the Pentagon CTO publicly articulating that embedded AI values are architecturally incompatible with unrestricted military use. Each of these escalation raises the stakes, and neither side is backing down. So March 24th, the preliminary hearing before Judge Rita Lynn, that is the next structural inflection. But today's pollute framing adds texture to this. It adds something that legal filings really didn't. It makes the government's position philosophically explicit. This isn't about one company. It's about whether any AI system built with any non-removable safety commitments conserves the state's most lethal functions. And I think all the companies knew that when they lined up behind Anthropic. All right, let's move over to the energy infrastructure arc. This has been building a specific argument since late February. Virtual power plants, state VPP legislation, sodium ion chemistry entering the grid, base power assembling 100 megawatts of residential batteries in Texas, PG&E's smart panel pilot, and now PJM unlocking latent capacity system-wide, and Virginia removing the utility from the solar equation entirely. Now, on March 4th, Virginia's HB 434 established the first state mandate requiring utilities to measure unused grid capacity. But today, PJM implements that principle at interstate scale. That trajectory is clear. The grid is being remeasured, re-permitted, and redistributed simultaneously, and the technology is improving. So what emerges is not just a grid with more capacity, it's a grid that knows itself better. All right, let's go on to the scientific measurement arc. This one's newer, but it's accelerating super fast. Obviously, we've got humanity's last exam. Okay, this is the third benchmark event that we've tracked in recent weeks. The ARC AGI-2 collapse was in February. The ongoing saturation of standard benchmarks is there, right? And now a test specifically engineered to stay ahead of capability. Already half closed by frontier systems are many of those capabilities. But each benchmark here tells us the same thing from a slightly different angle. The distance between what AI can do and what humans can do is compressing, and the rate of compression is itself accelerating. So the exam's designers built this to be perpetual. Now, whether it survives 2 years will tell us more about the trajectory of intelligence than any single model release. So let's use that benchmark. All right, let's talk a little bit about why I chose the human voice segment for today. It's Harrison Chase, co-founder of LangChain, and he's on the MAD podcast, the MAD podcast, from the Daytona Compute Conference. Now, I chose this because Chase is talking about the layer that actually determines whether AI works in practice. So this isn't about the models, but it's about the engineering around them, the harnesses around them. And this is important, even though it's a super technical topic. System prompts, subagents, file system context, skills libraries, secure sandboxes. He calls all this the post-cloud infrastructure layer. And his argument is that the real differentiation now comes from the human playbook that you encode, not the model that you're renting for inference. Now that framing lands differently after a day when the Pentagon called one of models' encoded values pollution. The values you build into the system, whether that's safety commitments or operational playbooks or institutional memory, they aren't decoration, they are architecture. And architecture, it turns out, is the thing everybody's fighting over. So check that out, the link's in the newsletter. Let's talk a bit about what shipped. Both Anthropic and OpenAI shipped interactive visualization features for their flagship products on the same day. Claude now auto-generates charts, diagrams, interactive graphics, clickable periodic tables, compound interest graphs directly there in your chat window. Now, OpenAI launched the same category of feature focused on math and science learning, manipulable graphs, concept simulations, adjustable visual models. So two companies arriving at the same interface insight simultaneously. That understanding improves when you can touch the output. Google rolled out Gemini task automation in beta on Samsung Galaxy S26 devices. So Gemini can now operate apps autonomously like Uber, DoorDash, and Starbucks in a virtual window, completing multi-step tasks and pausing for user confirmation before a final action. This is it. This is the agentic phone arriving in consumer hardware. It's happening here. And NVIDIA released AI Cluster Runtime as open source. This is a tool that publishes validated, reproducible Kubernetes configuration recipes for GPU clusters. And if you're building AI infrastructure at scale, this is the plumbing that matters. They also released a new version of TensorRT Edge LLM for their automotive and robotics platforms. So that adds support for more mixture of experts architectures and embedded speech processing. So physical AI getting an inference engine, essentially. 1,000 researchers built the hardest test they could imagine. They stripped out every question that any AI could answer, and the best systems alive closed half the distance anyway. Carry that image. This is not alarming. What it implies about tomorrow is that this exam, which was designed to be a permanent frontier, a boundary line between human expertise and machine capability that would hold, in its first encounter with frontier systems, half that territory was already contested. So very soon, let's watch for whether those scores continue to move. The benchmark is public now. The models will train against it or around it or through it. And when humanity's last exam stops being last and the remaining questions start falling, then the research community will need to build another boundary and another, moving those goalposts, each one closer to the thing that we can't quite name, the thing that makes human knowledge human. And the question will become, is that even something that is different between us humans and the systems that we're working with day by day by day? We'll see you tomorrow.